This video is late in a few ways. First of all, because I haven't posted a video in like 2 months. Second, because I'm talking about a controversy that's like 2 years old, but that's not going to stop me. Why does this image get me so angry? I don't use emojis that much, if at all, and I don't think I've ever used the gun emoji, that is, prior to the change. So if I probably am never going to use the gun emoji with or without the change, then why do I care so much? Of course, if the gun emoji never existed, then I would have no reason to get angry, because I would never think to get angry. But the fact that they added the gun emoji, that it was there in the first place, and then they went out of their way to remove it, that's what gets me angry. So that they didn't outright remove it, they removed it de facto by making it into this ridiculous thing where they exaggerate the fact that it's not a real gun, to the point where no one would ever actually want to use it. But officially, they didn't remove it, they just changed it. But the point still stands. If its removal doesn't affect me, why do I personally care about it? Well, it kind of comes down to not me caring about this specific instance, but a general pattern of social control that really transcends the current era, but I think has always existed. And a lot of the developments of the current era, though unprecedented, should be viewed through a light that I'm going to explain. There are two mental frameworks for this. The first, one piece of writing that has really affected me, and I think should be really required reading, is a piece by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He describes the intolerance of the minority. And just briefly, the premise is, let's say you have 5% of the population who are completely intolerant against doing things any other way than how they do things. And then you have the 95%, the general masses, who they would kind of prefer to do things a specific way, but they don't really mind. They don't really care how things are done. Whether things are done in the way of the minority or the majority, they would kind of prefer the majority, but they don't really care if it's done the way that the minority prefers. Well, all that the minority has to do is hold out and refuse to change and refuse to do anything other than the way that they insist on doing things. And if they wait long enough, then eventually the minority will have their way because of the asymmetry. Eventually, people will say, whatever, I'll do things the way that the minority wants. The second thing that's important to understand is network effects. And as they're relevant here, it sort of is a factor with respect to a lot of communication networks that all of the people communicating kind of use the same method of communication, so that way there's not the communication conflict. That's network effects as they are relevant here. So I think there are a lot of situations where people try to force a change on the grounds that you're being more sensitive if you do things a certain way, and then people just go along with it. And I'll use an example. An example is person first language. Person first language is when people say people with autism instead of saying autistic people. Now, it's probably easier to say autistic people. That's how English works. In English, you use the adjective first and then the noun. In French, you say people with autism. You say the noun first, but it's more natural in English to say the adjective first. But anyway, for whatever reason, people got it in their head that it's rude or dehumanizing to use the adjective first, and that you would better use the noun first, because if you use the noun first, then you're assigning more importance to it, that it comes first in some way. Of course, that's ridiculous, that's not how language works, but they got it in their head that that is how language works. They're obviously wrong about that, but eventually people came around to it, they thought, oh, okay, whatever. Even I came around to it. I thought, well, if I'm going to refer to a person with autism, I might as well just say person with autism, because I don't want people getting angry at me. Not that anyone would get angry at me, but I don't want to risk it, right? And I think in a lot of situations, people will fall into different camps. First, no one will know about the change, and they'll do things the old way. And then when they're informed about the change, they're informed, oh, you should do things this new way. Then 5% of them will be the enforcers. They'll be they'll really call you out if you do things the incorrect way. And then 90% of people will not care. They will just say, okay, I'll do things the new way because you tell me to. They're kind of obedient. And then 5% are the holdouts, and they um, really disagree. They think, no, I think that's ridiculous. Why can't I do things the old way? And those people are really important. But the thing is that those people, a lot of them will be ostracized by the 90% because not because they're right about what they're arguing, but just because they're being viewed as uncooperative. The 90% will think, hey, we all are willing to do things the new way. Why are you taking up all our time and causing a nuisance and just holding us back and being so annoying and being so uncooperative? So eventually the 90% are going to turn against the 5%, and at some point the 5% are going to realize, okay, whatever, I'll make the change. Or some of them will remain holdouts, but they'll just be ostracized. And I'm not talking here about big changes, like big sweeping developments. I'm talking about small piecemeal changes, the type of thing like person first language, where who really cares about person first language? It's not a real big cultural battle, and that's why I'm using it as an example. So I'll give another example. When I was in preschool, and remind you, I'm not that old. I'm pretty young, as is probably obvious from my voice. I'm pretty young. But when I was in preschool, um, I distinctly remember the teachers referring to sitting crisscross as Indian style. And I just assumed that's what it was called. It was called Indian style, to sit crisscross. And then when I joined the first grade after preschool, all of a sudden the teachers were calling Indian style crisscross applesauce. And I thought that was really annoying and obnoxious because as a kid I thought, hey, for, the old teachers were calling it one thing, the new teachers are calling it something else. Why do you have to do this to me? And obviously, most kids, they had either been raised their whole lives, it was called crisscross applesauce, or they just didn't care. And I didn't care, obviously, and it's not something you really should care that much about. But I obviously cared enough about it to remember it. That it was kind of weird that they changed it all of a sudden. And I guess it didn't take long between uh, preschool and kindergarten. Probably the people calling it Indian style in preschool were themselves kind of holdouts. But the reason for changing it was obvious, that Indian style, calling it Indian, was deemed offensive for whatever reason. Now, is it really offensive? I have no idea. In fact, it's probably not offensive. I'm pretty sure that the move to change it was pushed not by Native Americans, it was pushed by a subsect of white people, urbanites, annoying white ladies who think it's offensive even though they didn't actually talk to Native Americans. If they had it my way, I think it's fine to leave little vestigial linguistic reminders that a lot of American culture perhaps is influenced by Native American culture. The fact that they call crisscross maybe Indian style in America and they don't call that in Europe, it's kind of a reminder that American culture was once more Native American. It's not like it was a traditional Native American word, it's just a reference to Indians. If they had it my way, it's fine to leave it as a reference, so that just a reminder in a way, but I don't care ultimately. And then there is this question about what is motivating all of these minor changes. Not the ones I've listed, but you can probably imagine the types of changes I'm describing. What's motivating them? Well, it's obvious that there's an element politically to this, and it will just happen that all of these changes will line up politically with whatever is the orthodoxy of the day. But I think it goes beyond that. I don't think there is ever a period in history without just small changes to the culture. So, what is motivating that? Well, if we can imagine people in a tribe, and when I say tribe, I'm not saying that literally. You can kind of substitute in the word community. Just imagine a bunch of people in a community. Well, let's say you're the first person to propose the idea of person first language, and you propose, hey, I think that it's offensive to do things the old way, blah blah blah. Now let us suppose that your plan actually goes through and people do as you say and they actually change how they talk about things. Well, it is kind of a small, we can imagine, boost in status. The fact that a change which you implemented is now implemented. It is kind of a demonstration that you have ability to manipulate the culture, to manipulate how people do things. It's kind of a power move, right? So people are inclined to propose stuff like this, or even if they're not the ones proposing it. Let's say that you propose it, and then it becomes commonplace within your community, and then it can spread like an infection to other communities because there is a bit moving about, people move about, and then you were someone who was really one of the early adopters of this change, and you go to another community, and now it's your opportunity to have a small boost in status now that you can implement this change in your community, even if you didn't have the idea. You know that a lot of communities are making this change, so it's easy to implement this change because it's already the tidal wave. You're just surfing the tidal wave, and you will get maybe a small mental boost in your self-esteem, the knowledge that you were able to implement this change. And the change itself, it actually doesn't matter. The justification for it can be completely nonsense, can be completely arbitrary, and this is the ultimate point that I'm trying to make, is a lot of changes to culture are ultimately just completely arbitrary, and they only exist because one person thought maybe it would boost their status, at least mentally, it would boost their self-esteem to be able to demonstrate that they could implement a change in the culture. And then it becomes infectious, and everyone adopts it because of network effects. And the thing that's allowing this to take place is the force I talked about at the beginning of this video, where it's the power of the intolerant minority. If you have the minority who wants the change and a majority who don't really care, then the minority have the power to enforce their will. And the conclusion that this all leads up to is that this process that I'm describing to you, the thing is that I don't like it. And you can chalk it up in this case to maybe me just not liking how my opponents are getting what they want. But I think that's unfair. I don't like this process in general, how a bunch of nannies get to dictate what we all do. It's kind of more of a cringe, but also a hate-filled cringe. A cringe at the fact that they probably thought they were such good people when they implemented the change. They never got the embarrassment of realizing that their change was ultimately pointless. Instead, they probably felt a mixture of two feelings. First, that they were the prosecuted minorities who bravely stood up against the people who would otherwise prosecute them. And second, the feeling of themselves that they are knights of valor, people who are brave protectors of others, protectors of the weak, and moral doers of good. And I don't like their pleasure in this. But perhaps, now that it's 2020, that might be a lukewarm take at this point. But please like and subscribe. It's very important for this video, so I need to say that.